I know you're an Aldous Huxley fan, so I thought I'd ask you this question. After reading his book, Doors of Perception, in which he gives an account of his experience taking the psychedelic drug mescaline, he stated that in the final stages of egolessness, there is an obscene knowledge that all is in all, that all is actually each. He then went on to say that this is as near, I take it, as a finite mind can ever get to perceiving everything that is happening in the universe. I was wondering if maybe you could explain what that means, because I've been trying to understand it for a month.
There was a neuroscientist a while back, whose name I don't remember, who had a stroke. And she, being a neuroscientist, was analyzing the neurological consequences of the stroke as it occurred. If I remember correctly, the stroke either temporarily or more permanently took out the function of large portions of her left hemisphere. And she had exactly that experience. It was an experience of ego dissolution, something like that. The felt sense of identity shifting from that sort of narrow boundary, maybe that you would define by the boundary of your physical being, into something that was much broader and much. It gets hard to describe this without, degenerating into hippie poetry from 1967 very, very rapidly. But it's something like a sense of the underlying unity of consciousness. That might be one way of thinking about it. We don't know much about consciousness. In fact, I don't think we know anything about consciousness. And obviously, consciousness is something that we all share, but it's also something that we seem to also experience individually. But maybe our individual consciousnesses are something like the manifestations of something that's a more unified consciousness underneath. I mean, that's hardly an original idea. But it does seem to be the case that under some circumstances, there are neurological transformations that make that link more apparent, assuming that the link exists. Now, you could say, well, no, they're just producing a delusion. But the funny thing about, delusions is that you got to think, well, how do you know something's a delusion? And the answer to that has to be something like, well, hardly anyone else thinks it. That would be criteria number one. But criteria number two would be, if you act on the delusion, does your ship sink? Because if your ship sinks, then it was a delusion. It's something like that. But if you act on your delusion and things get better, well, then maybe it wasn't a delusion. And there's no evidence from the psilocybin studies that have been conducted at Johns Hopkins that there was detrimental effects for the participants. And the participants certainly don't think that the effects were detrimental. So, and I've been hesitant to talk about any of this for obvious reasons.